Hey guys, tonight we slow everything down and step carefully into the Victorian era, a time that looks elegant from a distance, but feels strangely uncomfortable once you're actually standing in it. You're on a narrow London street, just after sunset. The air is thick with coal smoke, damp stone, and the faint, ever-present smell of human life packed too tightly together. Gas lamps flicker uncertainly, casting yellow pools of light that never quite meet, leaving long stretches of shadow between them. You probably won't survive this era, not because of danger in the dramatic sense, but because almost everything requires patience, layers of clothing, and an exhausting amount of social performance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, feel free to share where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You quickly realize that Victorian life cannot be described with a single experience. It is not one world, but two that occupy the same streets without ever truly meeting. On one side, wealth piles upward into tall townhouses, layered with fabric, furniture, and etiquette. On the other, poverty spreads outward and downward into basements, alleys, and rooms never meant for sleeping. The distance between the richest and poorest Victorians is sometimes measured in inches of brick wall rather than miles of land. You start walking, boots clicking softly on uneven stones. Carriages pass you, wheels splashing through shallow puddles left behind by earlier rain. Inside those carriages, barely visible behind glass and curtains, are people wrapped in tailored coats, sitting upright, trying very hard not to appear to notice anything unpleasant outside. That unpleasantness includes you, at least for the moment. Victorian society is obsessed with appearances. This is a mainstream historical fact that scholars agree on. Respectability matters more than comfort, honesty, or even health. How you look, how you behave, and how closely you follow unspoken rules determines your worth almost as much as your income. Historians still argue whether this obsession was driven more by fear of social collapse or by genuine belief in moral hierarchy. But standing here, it feels like both. You glance down at yourself. Clothing matters immediately. If you're wealthy, your clothes are clean, structured, and slightly impractical. If you're poor, they're worn thin, layered out of necessity rather than style, and never quite dry. Either way, you are wrapped tightly, restricted by fabric that scratches, pulls, and demands constant adjustment. Freedom of movement is not a Victorian priority. As you walk, you notice the buildings change almost imperceptibly. Ornate stonework gives way to plain brick. Windows shrank. Light becomes rarer. Somewhere above you, someone plays a piano, slow, deliberate notes drifting through an open window. Somewhere below you, unseen, someone coughs repeatedly, a deep, wet sound that seems to come from the walls themselves. These sounds coexist without acknowledgement. One quirky but well-documented detail of Victorian cities is that smells were everywhere, and unavoidable. There is no true sanitation yet, at least not consistently. Sewers exist in theory and occasionally in practice. Horse manure, human waste, coal smoke, and industrial runoff mix into a kind of ambient background that Victorians simply accept. Historians still debate how much people truly noticed these smells versus how much they mentally filtered them out. You suspect the latter, because otherwise nothing would ever get done. The rich, meanwhile, believe cleanliness is a moral trait. A clean home suggests a clean soul. Of course, maintaining that cleanliness requires an army of servants who are very much not clean themselves by the end of the day. This contradiction is never addressed openly. You are not supposed to think too hard about it. You pass a large townhouse, and catch a glimpse inside as the door opens briefly. Warm light spills out, revealing polished wood, patterned wallpaper, and a thick carpet that absorbs sound. Inside, the world is quieter, softer. Someone is announcing a visitor's name in a careful, practiced voice. This is the Victorian upper world, where life is choreographed and silence is a luxury. A few steps later, you pass a narrow entrance leading down instead of up. Stone steps descend into darkness. This is where poorer families live below street level, closer to damp earth and leaking pipes. These rooms were never designed for comfort or even habitation, yet entire families sleep, eat, and work inside them. A mainstream historical fact is that overcrowding was one of the defining features of Victorian urban poverty. Historians still argue exactly how many people shared single rooms. but estimates suggest numbers that make modern fire codes quietly scream. You pause for a moment, listening. The city never fully sleeps. Somewhere, a factory whistle blows late. Somewhere else, laughter erupts and fades just as quickly. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries, the sound muffled by walls that were never thick enough. This is not a dramatic, cinematic misery. It's persistent, exhausting, and deeply ordinary. Victorians love order. Even when life refuses to cooperate, everything is categorized: class, gender, morality, even leisure. The richest Victorians believe they have earned their comfort through discipline and virtue. The poorest are often blamed for their own hardship, accused of laziness or moral weakness. Historians still argue how sincerely these beliefs were held versus how convenient they were, but the result is the same. A society comfortable with extreme imbalance, as long as it looks tidy on paper. You keep walking. Slower now. Your breath fogs faintly in the cool air. You realize that Victorian life, whether rich or poor, is filled with waiting. Waiting for meals, waiting for wages, waiting for letters, waiting for permission. Even wealth does not eliminate waiting. It just makes it quieter and more upholstered. And as you continue down the street, moving between lamplight and shadow, you begin to understand the strange truth of this era. The Victorian world is not loud about its inequalities. It whispers them constantly, and if you listen carefully, without rushing, those whispers are everywhere, soft, repetitive, and oddly like the steady hum of a city that never quite rests. You slow your steps even more now, letting the rhythm of the street carry you forward. This is where our night begins, between velvet curtains and bare brick, between abundance and absence. In a world where how the richest and poorest live side by side will unfold, slowly, one careful moment at a time. You drift now toward the homes of the very wealthy, where the street grows quieter and the lamps seem to burn just a little steadier, as if they, too, have been better funded. These houses rise tall and narrow, pressed shoulder to shoulder like well-dressed strangers who politely pretend not to touch. From the outside, they look impressive in a restrained way: brick facades, scrubbed clean, iron railings polished, windows framed by heavy curtains that hint at comfort without revealing too much. Inside, everything expands. The moment you step across the threshold, sound changes. Your footsteps sink into thick carpets designed to swallow noise and prevent drafts. This is deliberate. A mainstream historical fact is that wealthy Victorians valued quiet as a sign of refinement. Noise belonged to factories, streets, and poorer districts. Silence, like space, was something money could buy. The air smells different here. Instead of damp stone and coal smoke, you catch polished wood, beeswax, and faint floral notes from potpourri or cleaning solutions. Fires burn in multiple rooms at once, each carefully tended. Coal is expensive, but discomfort is unacceptable. Still, even here, warmth is uneven. Large houses lose heat easily, and servants move constantly, opening and closing doors, stoking grates, adjusting screens. Historians still argue how genuinely comfortable these homes were, but you quickly sense that comfort requires effort and constant maintenance. Furniture fills every available surface: chairs, tables, cabinets, Ottoman siege-piece, heavy, solid, and often carved with unnecessary enthusiasm. Empty space is suspicious. Victorians associate fullness with prosperity and morality. A sparsely furnished room suggests either poverty or dangerous modern ideas. One quirky historical detail is that many wealthy households owned furniture they rarely used, simply because having it mattered more than sitting on it. Walls are layered as thoroughly as the people who live here. Wallpaper patterns compete with framed paintings, mirrors, and decorative plates. Curtains hang thick and heavy, often doubled or tripled, blocking drafts and prying eyes alike. Light is controlled carefully. Gas lamps glow softly, never harsh, casting a warm haze that flatters skin and hides imperfections. You begin to understand that Victorian wealth is as much about managing appearances as it is about possessing things. Servants move through these spaces like well-trained shadows. They know exactly where to step, when to speak, and most importantly, when not to. A mainstream historical fact is that domestic service was one of the largest sources of employment in Victorian Britain, especially for women. Historians still argue whether service offered opportunity or exploitation, but standing here, you sense both. Servants are essential and yet meant to be unnoticed, a contradiction quietly upheld by routine. You notice how bells are placed strategically throughout the house. A pull of a cord summons assistance without effort. Someone else will bring tea, adjust the fire, carry a message upstairs. Waiting exists here too, but it's outsourced. The wealthy wait comfortably while others move on their behalf. Meals in these homes are rituals rather than necessities. The dining room feels formal even when no guests are present. Chairs are arranged with precision. Tablecloths are pressed smooth. Cutlery is polished to a dull shine rather than a blinding one. Too much sparkle would be considered showy. Historians still debate how often wealthy families actually dined together, but the room is always prepared as if they might. Food arrives in courses, paced carefully. Eating too quickly suggests poor breeding. Eating too much suggests poor self-control. Victorian elites are obsessed with digestion. There are rules about what combinations of food are acceptable, when certain items should be eaten, and how long one should rest afterward. A quirky but true detail is that many Victorians believed improper digestion could cause moral weakness. Your stomach, it seems, is also responsible for your character. Upstairs bedrooms reflect a similar mix of luxury and discomfort. Beds are large, framed in heavy wood or metal, but mattresses are often firm by modern standards. Featherbeds exist, but they are not universal. You sleep under layers of blankets, wearing nightclothes that cover almost everything. Modesty extends even into private moments. Historians still argue how prudish Victorians truly were versus how much was performance. But the layers alone feel exhausting. Bathing is infrequent and planned. Hot water must be heated manually and carried upstairs. A full bath is an event, not a daily habit. Many wealthy Victorians fear that frequent bathing might weaken the body or invite illness. Instead, they rely on washing specific parts and changing linen often. Cleanliness is achieved indirectly, through fabric and routine, rather than through immersion. You wander through the halls slowly, noticing how insulated this world feels from the street outside. Windows are thick, curtains heavy. Sounds from the city arrive muffled and distant, if at all. This separation is intentional. The wealthy Victorian home is designed to protect its occupants from reminders of labor, poverty, and unpleasantness. Historians still debate whether this insulation bred ignorance or anxiety. Perhaps both. Despite all this comfort, a subtle tension lingers. Social rules are everywhere. You must sit correctly, speak correctly, dress correctly, even think correctly. Reputation is fragile. Gossip travels faster than carriages. A single misstep, a rumor, an improper friendship, a visible stain can unravel years of careful presentation. Wealth cushions you, but it also binds you. As evening settles, lamps are lit one by one, curtains are drawn, fires are banked for the night. The house grows quieter, but never still. Somewhere below stairs, servants finish their tasks, voices low, movements efficient. Somewhere above, someone reads by lamplight, careful not to strain their eyes. Somewhere else, someone lies awake, worrying not about survival, but about status. You pause, listening to the muted heartbeat of the house. This is how the richest Victorians live, surrounded by objects, buffered by labor, constrained by expectation. It is comfortable, yes, but also rigid, layered, and quietly demanding. Even here, rest must be earned, performed, and maintained. And as you let the calm, upholstered silence settle around you, you begin to sense that this is only half the story. Just beyond these walls, life unfolds very differently, and soon, slowly, without hurry, you'll step back outside and descend into the other Victorian world waiting below. You wake in one of these wealthy Victorian bedrooms feeling oddly constrained, even before you open your eyes. The bed is large, but the space around you feels carefully managed. Heavy curtains block most of the morning light, allowing only a dim, polite glow to filter through. The air is still. It smells faintly of starch, coal smoke from distant fires, and whatever perfume was chosen to be respectable rather than expressive. You lie there for a moment, listening. The house is already awake, though not loudly. Somewhere below, a servant moves quietly across a tiled floor. A door opens and closes with deliberate softness. Water is being poured, not rushed. A mainstream historical fact is that wealthy Victorian households often ran on strict daily schedules, especially in the morning. The rhythm of the house begins long before its owners officially rise. You don't leap out of bed, that would be unseemly. Instead, you wait. Waiting is part of the ritual. Eventually, assistance arrives, perhaps a maid drawing back the curtains just enough. Perhaps a gentle knock signaling that the day may now begin. Historians still argue how much independence wealthy Victorians had in their private routines. But here, privacy feels supervised rather than solitary. You sit up carefully. The mattress is firm, designed to promote good posture even during sleep. Featherbeds exist, but there's suspicion around anything too soft. Comfort should support morality, not encourage indulgence. This philosophy seeps into everything. You slide your feet into slippers and stand, already aware of the chill in the room. Fires are not kept burning overnight, unless absolutely necessary. Coal costs money, and discipline must be visible even in wealthy homes. Dressing is a process, not a choice. Clothing is layered with intention. Undergarments, first linen or cotton, clean and freshly pressed. Then structured layers that shape your body into what Victorian society considers appropriate. For women, this means corsetry, stiffened skirts, multiple petticoats. For men, tailored trousers, waistcoats, carefully buttoned shirts. A quirky but true historical detail is that many Victorians believed proper clothing helped maintain proper behavior. Loose garments invited loose morals. You feel it immediately. Movement is possible, but controlled. Sitting, standing, bending all require awareness. This constant bodily mindfulness becomes second nature. Historians still debate whether Victorians felt physically restricted or simply adapted, but from where you stand, it's hard to imagine ever forgetting what you're wearing. Personal hygiene follows a similar logic. A full bath is rare and planned. Hot water must be heated and carried, an inconvenience even in wealthy homes. Instead, you wash selectively, face hands, perhaps arms using basins brought in by servants. Fresh linen does much of the work. Clean clothes stand in for clean bodies. This is not neglect, it's the accepted system. Many Victorians believe excessive bathing weakens the body, opening it to illness. Cleanliness, like morality, must be managed carefully. Hair is brushed thoroughly. This matters. Shiny, orderly hair reflects self-control. Teeth are cleaned with powders that taste unpleasant but promise virtue. Mirrors are consulted, not to admire, but to ensure correctness. You are not expressing yourself. You are presenting compliance. Breakfast waits downstairs, but not immediately. There is a proper interval. Eating too soon is uncouth. You occupy yourself quietly, perhaps reading, perhaps simply sitting until summoned. Silence is comfortable here, even expected. A mainstream historical fact is that literacy rates among the wealthy were high, and reading was considered a suitable, calming activity. You read not to escape, but to demonstrate composure. Eventually, you descend the stairs, moving past portraits of family members who seem to watch carefully. These images reinforce continuity and expectation. You are part of a line. Deviations are discouraged. Historians still argue how much pressure this created, but the walls themselves feel heavy with it. The dining room is cool and orderly. Breakfast is light by modern standards: toast, eggs, tea poured precisely. The meal unfolds slowly. Conversation, if any, is restrained. Topics are safe. Whether correspondence, minor social updates, strong opinions are saved for private moments, if they are saved at all. A quirky detail is that many Victorians feared speaking too passionately before breakfast might upset digestion. Emotional regulation begins early. After breakfast, the day divides neatly along class and gender lines. If you are wealthy, your labor is largely symbolic. Men may attend offices, meetings, or clubs where decisions are made in rooms far removed from physical work. Women oversee households, social calendars, charitable efforts. This is work, but it is invisible by design. Historians still debate how fulfilling these roles were, but they are taken seriously, performed with dedication. Time passes gently but rigidly. Clocks are everywhere. Timekeeping matters. Punctuality reflects respectability. Being late suggests moral weakness. You watch the minutes move without urgency, aware that your schedule is full but not exhausting. This too is a luxury. As afternoon approaches, you may take a short walk, never too far, never alone without reason. Streets in wealthy districts are cleaner, quieter. Shop windows display goods you do not need, but may purchase to reinforce your position. Consumption is careful, deliberate. Buying too much is vulgar. Buying too little raises questions. By evening, fatigue sets in, not from physical exertion, but from constant self. You return home, where lamps are lit and curtains drawn once more. Dinner will be more elaborate, governed by even stricter rules. Later, entertainment may follow music, conversation, perhaps a guest, but always within boundaries. As you prepare for bed again, the layers reverse. Clothing is removed piece by piece. You slip back into nightwear designed to conceal rather than comfort. You lie down, carefully arranged, blankets pulled just so. The house quiets around you, though it never fully rests. You stare at the ceiling, listening to distant sounds softened by wealth and architecture. You are safe, warm enough, fed, and yet there is a subtle restlessness. This life is secure, but narrow. Everything is planned, structured, monitored. Even sleep feels supervised by expectation. This is how the richest Victorians live, not extravagantly wild, but meticulously contained. Comfort exists, yes, but it is layered with restraint, routine, and the quiet pressure to always be proper. And as your breathing slows and the room fades into shadow, you sense that while poverty may crush the body, wealth, in its own gentle way, weighs heavily on the mind. Morning gives way to the slow, carefully managed middle of the day, and you begin to understand that for the wealthy Victorian, time itself is a kind of possession. It is measured, scheduled, and protected from intrusion, while the poor are chased by the clock, by factory bells. Hunger and exhaustion you are cushioned by it. Your hours unfold gently, padded with ritual and expectation. After breakfast, the house does not empty. It rearranges itself. Servants move through rooms, restoring order that was never truly disturbed. Crumbs vanish. Chairs are nudged back into perfect alignment. Fires are checked, adjusted, fed just enough to maintain warmth without waste. A mainstream historical fact is that maintaining a wealthy Victorian household required constant labor behind the scenes. Historians still argue how visible or invisible this labor was meant to be, but here, its absence is part of the illusion. You spend the late morning engaged in activities that signal purpose without strain. Reading letters takes time. Writing responses takes even more. Every word is chosen carefully, because correspondence is a public extension of reputation. Handwriting matters. Paper quality matters. Ink color matters. A letter is not just information, it is a performance of stability and breeding. You pause often, not from uncertainty, but from caution. If you are a man of means, you may leave the house for business or social obligations. This does not resemble work in the physical sense. You travel by carriage or on foot through streets designed to feel orderly and safe. Offices are quiet places where decisions are made far from the consequences they produce. You discuss investments, policies, shipments, and schedules while seated comfortably. Historians still debate how disconnected Victorian elites were from the realities of industrial labor, but the distance feels intentional. If you are a woman of means, your responsibilities remain closer to home, but they are no less structured. Household management is considered a serious duty. You oversee servants, plan meals, schedule visits, and coordinate charitable efforts. Charity is especially important. It reinforces moral authority. Helping the poor at a distance confirms your own respectability. A quirky but telling detail is that many charitable visits were carefully staged, ensuring benefactors were never exposed to discomfort for too long. Lunch, when it occurs, is light. Heavy meals in the middle of the day are frowned upon. Digestion must not interfere with propriety. Tea may appear instead, accompanied by small bites that suggest restraint rather than hunger. Historians still argue how much Victorians actually ate versus how much they claimed to eat. But appetite is something to be managed, not indulged. The house itself seems to breathe around you. Curtains are adjusted to control sunlight. Rugs soften footsteps. Doors close gently. Sound is managed as carefully as temperature. Noise is considered vulgar, associated with industry and disorder. Silence, by contrast, signals control. You find yourself lowering your voice automatically, even when no one has asked you to. By early afternoon, fatigue sets in, but rest is formalized. You may recline briefly, read quietly, or take a short nap. This is not laziness, it is preservation. Wealth allows you to avoid exhaustion, which in Victorian thinking is associated with moral weakness and social instability. Historians still debate how much rest the wealthy actually took, but the option itself is a privilege. Outside, the city continues its relentless motion, but you are insulated from it. Thick walls and layered windows soften everything. The cries of street vendors, the rumble of carts, The distant clang of machinery arrive muffled, if they arrive at all. You are aware of the city in theory, not in sensation. Social visits may fill the afternoon. These are carefully timed and governed by etiquette. Calling cards are exchanged. Visits are short unless explicitly extended. Conversation remains polite, controlled, and largely superficial. Strong emotions are inappropriate. Controversial topics are avoided. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian social interactions were governed by complex rules that everyone pretended were natural. Historians still argue whether these rules provided comfort or constraint. Sitting here, they feel like both. Clothing remains a constant presence. Layers restrict movement and require awareness. You sit upright, not because it is comfortable, but because it is correct. Slouching suggests carelessness. Carelessness suggests moral decline. The body becomes another thing to manage, like time or space. As daylight begins to fade, the house shifts again. Lamps are lit deliberately, one room at a time. Curtains are drawn with ceremony. Fires are encouraged, coaxed into brighter life. The transition from day to evening is marked, not by exhaustion, but by preparation. Dinner approaches, and dinner matters. Dinner is the most important meal of the day, both nutritionally and socially. It is formal, structured, and time-consuming. Courses arrive in sequence. Conversation is regulated. Eating too quickly suggests greed. Eating too slowly suggests disinterest. You balance your pace carefully, aware that others are doing the same. Historians still debate how enjoyable these meals actually were, but enjoyment is secondary to correctness. After dinner, entertainment may follow. Music is common: piano, singing, perhaps light performance. This is not spontaneous. It is planned, rehearsed, and restrained. Applause is polite. Criticism, if it exists, is subtle. You participate because participation is expected. Withdrawal would be noticed that by the time evening deepens, you feel a particular kind of tiredness. It is not the exhaustion of labor, but the fatigue of constant self-awareness. Every gesture, every word, every pause has been measured against expectation. This is the quiet cost of privilege. As the household prepares for night once more, you retreat upstairs. Servants complete their final tasks, unseen but essential. You undress slowly, reversing the day's layers. Nightwear replaces structure with concealment. Even rest must remain modest. You lie down again, listening to the softened sounds of a wealthy Victorian house settling into sleep. Somewhere below, a clock ticks steadily. Somewhere outside, the city hums on, indifferent. You are safe, comfortable, and constrained. This is the rhythm of the richest Victorians, a life buffered from hardship, shaped by ritual, and sustained by labor they rarely acknowledge. It is calm, controlled, and quietly exhausting in ways that are difficult to name. And as your breathing slows, you begin to sense that while wealth shields the body, it binds the spirit, tightly wrapping it in velvet. Yes, but wrapping it all the same. Eventually, gently, almost without ceremony, you step away from the upholstered quiet of wealth and move toward the other Victorian world, the one that exists just a street or two away, yet might as well belong to another century. The transition is subtle at first. The pavement grows uneven. The lamps are fewer and dimmer. The air thickens again, carrying stronger scents of coal smoke, refuse, and damp brick. This is where money thins out, and life becomes louder, closer, and far less padded. Here, homes do not rise proudly above the street. They sink. Basements, back rooms, subdivided houses, and narrow courts take over. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian urban poverty was defined by overcrowding more than outright homelessness. Families lived stacked on top of one another, sometimes with multiple households sharing a single room. Historians still argue exact numbers, but even conservative estimates suggest conditions that would feel unbearable to modern sensibilities. You descend a short flight of stone steps into a basement dwelling. Light is scarce. A small window near the ceiling admits a grey, reluctant glow, often blocked by street dirt or passing feet. The walls are damp to the touch. Moisture seeps in constantly, bringing cold with it. Fires are rare and small fuel costs money, and money is always short. Warmth is borrowed sparingly, like everything else. Inside, space is not divided by function. Sleeping, eating, working, and resting all happen in the same few square feet. Furniture is minimal, not by design, but by necessity. A table, perhaps, a few stools, beds that double as seating during the day. Mattresses are thin, often shared. Privacy does not exist as a concept here. It is a luxury imagined elsewhere. You notice the sound immediately. Voices overlap. Children cry. Adults argue, laugh, cough. Everything echoes. Walls are thin. Doors ill. Silence is rare and often alarming when it appears. A quirky but true detail is that many Victorian reformers believed noise itself was a symptom of poverty, rather than a result of overcrowding. From where you stand, the distinction feels academic at best. Morning arrives early here, not because of routine, but because sleep never fully settles. People wake cold, stiff, hungry. There is no waiting politely in bed. The day begins because it must. If work is available, it must be reached early. If food is scarce, time cannot be wasted. You dress quickly, pulling on clothes that are never fully dry, never fully clean. Layers are practical, not structured. Fabric hangs loosely, shaped by use rather than fashion. Hygiene follows different rules here, not from ignorance, but from limitation. Water must be fetched. Soap costs money. Washing happens when possible, not when ideal. A mainstream historical fact is that poor Victorians were often blamed for uncleanliness, even though they lacked access to clean water and sanitation. Historians still argue how much moral judgment shaped public health policy, but standing here, the imbalance is painfully obvious. Breakfast, if it exists, is simple and filling when possible. Bread, tea, perhaps porridge, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger is familiar, but rarely dramatic. It hums in the background, shaping decisions quietly. Children eat when there is food. Adults often eat later, or less. This is not spoken aloud. It is understood. Work dominates thought. If you are lucky, you have steady employment, factory labor, domestic service, dock work, street selling. If you are unlucky, you search daily. Men, women, and children all contribute. A mainstream historical fact is that child labor was widespread in Victorian Britain, particularly among the poor. Historians still debate how families felt about this, but here, survival overrides ideology. Children work because families need income. There is no romantic framing. You step outside again and join the flow of bodies moving toward labor. Streets are crowded, chaotic, carts rattle past, vendors shout, factory whistles cut through the air with authority. Time here is not owned, it is enforced. Being late means losing wages. Losing wages means hunger. You walk quickly, eyes down, conserving energy. The work itself is repetitive, exhausting, and often dangerous. Factories are loud and poorly ventilated. Workshops are cramped. Domestic service, though safer physically, demands long hours and obedience. A quirky but grim detail is that many poor Victorians measured time not by clocks, but by bodily fatigue, how much the arms could lift, how long the back could bend. Historians still argue how resilient workers truly were versus how much they simply endured. Returning home after work does not bring rest in the way it does for the wealthy. Home is another site of labor. Cooking, cleaning, mending, caring for children, caring for the sick all happen here, without pause. Meals are stretched, watered down, repeated. Leftovers are not a category, they are a strategy. Illness looms constantly. Damp air, poor nutrition, and close quarters invite disease. Coughs linger, fevers spread. A mainstream historical fact is that life expectancy among the Victorian poor was dramatically lower than among the wealthy. Historians still debate precise figures, but the gap is undeniable. You do not think in terms of years here, you think in terms of getting through the week. Evening brings exhaustion, but not silence. Rooms fill again as everyone returns. Light is dim candles or a single lamp, carefully rationed. Conversations are louder now, not from joy, but from proximity. Stories are shared. Complaints surface briefly, then fade. Laughter appears unexpectedly, sharp and short-lived. Humor survives here, stubbornly. Sleep comes in fragments. Beds are crowded. Noise continues through the night. The city presses in from all sides. You curl inward, conserving warmth, conserving energy, conserving hope without naming it. There is no ceremony to rest. You sleep because your body gives up. And yet, within all this, life persists. Bonds form, communities exist, neighbors watch children when they can. Someone shares a scrap of food, someone passes along news of work. Historians still argue how strong these communal ties truly were, but you feel them in small, practical ways. Survival here is collective, whether acknowledged or not. As you lie there, half awake, listening to breathing, coughing, footsteps above, you understand the other half of the Victorian story. This is how the poorest live, not loudly tragic, but relentlessly constrained, not without dignity, but without cushioning. Life here is immediate, physical, and unforgiving, and as your breathing slows, matched to the rhythm of bodies packed too closely together, you begin to see the error more clearly. Wealth and poverty are not separate worlds. They are adjacent rooms, divided by walls thin enough that sound, smoke, and consequence pass easily through whether anyone chooses to listen or not. Morning among the poor does not arrive gently. It pushes its way in through thin walls and uncovered windows, bringing cold, noise, and urgency with it. You wake not because you are rested, but because remaining still has become uncomfortable. Limbs are stiff, the air is heavy and damp. Someone nearby is already moving, stepping carefully over bodies that fill the floor and beds alike. There is no private moment to stretch or gather your thoughts. The day begins immediately, whether you are ready or not. You sit up slowly, mindful of where you place your feet. Space is negotiated constantly. Every movement requires awareness of others. This closeness is not intimacy, it is logistics. A mainstream historical fact is that entire Victorian families often lived and slept in a single room, especially in industrial cities. Historians still argue how people psychologically adapted to this, but from here, adaptation looks less like comfort and more like endurance. The air smells stale, layered with last night's cooking, damp clothing, and human presence. Windows, when they exist, are rarely opened in winter. Cold is feared more than bad air. Many Victorians believe fresh night air invites illness. This belief crosses class lines, but its consequences fall hardest here. You breathe shallowly, conserving warmth. Dressing happens quickly. Clothes are pulled on without ceremony. They are heavy with use, patched and repacked. Nothing matches, but everything serves a purpose. You layer to trap heat, not to present an image. A quirky but telling detail is that poor Victorians often owned only one set of clothing suitable for work, sleep, and public appearance. You are always dressed for everything at once. Children wake too, rubbing eyes, already alert, in a way that feels learned rather than natural. There is no separation between childhood and responsibility here. Small hands are useful. Older children help younger ones dress, fetch water, carry items. A mainstream historical fact is that children in poor Victorian families were expected to contribute as soon as they were able. Historians still debate how families felt about this, but from where you stand, necessity leaves little room for sentiment. Water must be fetched if there is any hope of washing or cooking. You step outside into the narrow street or courtyard, joining others already moving with buckets and tins. The ground is slick, waste runs along shallow channels. You step carefully, not because it is clean, but because falling would cost energy you cannot spare. You wait your turn at a pump or tap, hands numbing as you work. Cold water splashes onto boots, already damp from yesterday. Back inside, someone prepares a simple meal if food allows. Bread is cut thin. Tea is weak but warm. Porridge, when available, is stretched with water. Hunger is familiar, but it rarely sparks drama. It simply exists. Adults often eat less, or later, without discussion. Children eat first when possible. This is not generosity, it is strategy. Bart calls early. If you are employed in a factory, lateness is punished. If you sell goods on the street, you need your spot before someone else takes it. If you clean, sew, haul, or serve, someone else controls your hours. Time here is rigid and unforgiving. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian labour schedules were long and poorly regulated, especially before labour reforms. Historians still argue how effective these reforms were, but you feel their absence more than any promise of change. You move with the crowd, bodies flowing, toward factories, docks, workshops. The streets pulse now, carts rattle, vendors shout, smoke thickens as chimneys come alive. Sound presses in from every direction. Unlike the wealthy districts, noise is constant and unavoidable. Silence would feel unnatural here, even suspicious. Work is repetitive. Machines demand attention without rest. Hands ache, backs bend, ears ring. The hours stretch, marked by bells or whistles rather than clocks you own. A quirky but grim detail is that many workers measured time by physical thresholds. When the hands began to shake, when the legs felt hollow, Historians still debate how workers coped mentally, but coping here means continuing. If you are fortunate, work continues steadily. If not, you wait. Waiting for labor is its own exhaustion. You stand in lines, watch doors, listen for rumors of hiring. Pride erodes quickly under hunger. Decisions become practical rather than moral. You take what is offered. Returning home does not end the day's work. Meals must be prepared. Clothes must be mended. Children must be watched. Someone is always sick. Someone is always tired. There is no clear boundary between labor and rest. A mainstream historical fact is that domestic labor consumed enormous time among the Victorian poor, particularly for women. Historians still argue how visible this work was, but it fills every available moment. Illness spreads easily. A cough passes from one person to the next without permission. Fevers appear suddenly. Medical care is expensive and limited. Folk remedies are common not from superstition, but from lack of alternatives. Rest is prescribed when possible, though it rarely is. You do not stop working because you are sick. You stop because you cannot stand. That evening arrives slowly, marked more by fatigue than by light. Candles are lit sparingly. Fuel is precious. The room fills again with people returning from work. Noise rises not from joy, but from compression. Conversations overlap. Arguments flare briefly, then fade. Laughter appears unexpectedly, sharp and fleeting. A release valve, rather than a celebration. Despite everything, routines form. People know who lives where. Neighbors recognize one another's children. Information is shared where work might be found. Who is ill? Who needs help? Historians still debate the strength of working-class community bonds, but here, survival depends on awareness. You notice things. You remember faces. Sleep comes reluctantly. Bodies collapse into beds or onto floors. Blankets are shared. You curl inward, conserving warmth. Noise continues through the night, footsteps above, voices outside, the distant hum of industry that never fully stops. You sleep in fragments, waking often, never fully resting. As you lie there, half awake, you understand something important. Life here is not defined by despair alone. It is defined by persistence, by adaptation, by making do, again and again, without applause or pause. This is how the poorest Victorians live, not in constant crisis, but in constant negotiation with limited resources. And as your breathing finally slows, sinking with the crowded room around you, you sense how deeply different this world is from the one of velvet curtains and scheduled rest. Yet they exist together, bound by the same city, the same era, the same invisible threads of labor and dependence, whether anyone chooses to acknowledge them or not. Food, for the Victorian poor, is not an event. It is a calculation. You think about it constantly, not in grand, anxious spirals, but in small, practical adjustments. How long will the bread last if it's cut thinner? How much water can be added to the pot before it becomes pointless? Which meal can be skipped without too much complaint? These questions shape the day as surely as factory bells. You stand near the hearth, or what passes for one, and watch a pot heat slowly. Fuel is limited. Fire is coaxed, not commanded. A mainstream historical fact is that poor Victorian families spent a significant portion of their income on food, often the majority. Historians still argue exactly how many calories the urban poor consumed daily, but most agree it was barely enough, especially during hard winters. Bread is the foundation. Dark, coarse, sometimes stale. You eat it anyway. Tea accompanies nearly everything, not for nourishment, but for warmth and habit. Sugar, when available, is a luxury stretched thin. A quirky but telling detail is that tea was sometimes drunk without milk, not by choice, but because milk spoiled quickly and cost money. The ritual remained even when the substance changed. Meals are rarely shared ceremonially. People eat when they can, where they can. Children eat first when possible, because they must keep growing. Adults eat later, or less. This pattern is not discussed. It is understood. Hunger is managed quietly, without language. Cooking is repetitive and slow. Stews, porridges, boiled vegetables when available. Meat is rare, saved for special days or when wages allow. When it appears, it is stretched into broths, flavored more by memory than by quantity. Historians still debate how often the poor ate meat, but here, its absence feels normal rather than shocking. You notice how taste changes under constraint. Warmth matters more than flavor. Fullness matters more than variety. Food that fills the stomach, even briefly, brings a sense of relief that settles the body. You eat slowly, not out of refinement, but because rushing would make it end too soon. Children learn these rhythms early. They know when to ask for more and when not to. They know how to distract hunger with play or sleep. A mainstream historical fact is that childhood malnutrition was widespread among the Victorian poor, affecting growth and health long term. Historians still argue how aware families were of these effects. But here, survival takes priority over foresight. Sharing happens informally. A neighbor passes a crust. Someone adds water to the pot so everyone gets something. These gestures are small but meaningful. They reinforce connection without obligation. You remember who helped. You help when you can. Community here is practical rather than sentimental. As evening settles, food runs out before hunger does. The pot is scraped clean. Dishes are rinsed quickly to preserve water. Scraps are saved, even if their future use is uncertain. Nothing is wasted casually. Waste is a moral failure imposed by necessity. You lie back afterward, stomach not full but quiet enough. Hunger does not disappear. It recedes. This is enough for now. Tomorrow will bring another calculation, another careful adjustment. And as you drift towards sleep, the steady rhythm of limited meals blends into the background of Victorian poverty, unremarkable and shaping everything in ways that rarely make it into polite conversation. Clothing, among the Victorian poor, is less about expression and more about endurance. You feel it the moment you move. Fabric stiff from repeated washing, seams reinforced with mismatched thread, cuffs worn thin and shiny from years of contact. These garments are not chosen each morning. They are simply put back on because they are what exists. You tug a coat tighter around yourself, feeling its weight settle unevenly across your shoulders. It was never tailored for you. Perhaps it once belonged to someone larger, or smaller, or simply different. Clothes are passed down, traded, altered, patched, and repatched until their original shape is only a suggestion. A mainstream historical fact is that second-hand clothing markets thrived in Victorian cities, supplying the poor with garments the wealthy had discarded. Historians still argue how extensive this trade was, but its presence is unmistakable here. You dress in layers not for fashion, but for survival. Each layer traps a little warmth, a little dignity. Wool scratches, but cotton absorbs sweat and damp, then clings uncomfortably. Nothing dries completely indoors. Clothes smell faintly of smoke, body heat, and yesterday's weather. This scent becomes familiar, almost invisible to you, though outsiders might recoil. Shoes are especially precious. A good pair can mean the difference between working and being turned away. Soles are thin, often uneven, repaired with whatever materials are available. You walk carefully, aware of each stone beneath your feet. A quirky but telling detail is that many poor Victorians padded their shoes with paper or rags for warmth. Comfort is improvised. Washing clothes is a labor-intensive task. Water must be fetched, heated if possible, and reused carefully. Soap is rationed. Scrubbing is done by hand, bending over tubs that strain the back. Laundry days are exhausting, but necessary. Clean clothes, even briefly clean ones, help ward off illness and judgment alike. A mainstream historical fact is that public laundries and washhouses were introduced in some cities to address sanitation issues. Historians still debate their accessibility, but for many, washing at home remains the only option. You hang damp garments wherever space allows on lines, over chairs, near what little heat exists. Drying takes time. Sometimes clothes are put back on while still slightly wet, especially in winter. You endure the chill because the alternative is having nothing to wear. Clothing is never idle here. It is either worn, washed, or waiting to be needed again. Children grow faster than clothes can accommodate. Sleeves end too soon. Trousers are rolled, then unrolled, then patched. Shoes are outgrown, then handed down. A mainstream historical fact is that poor Victorian children often wore adult-sized clothing altered repeatedly as they grew. Historians still argue how this affected mobility and health, but you see it in the way children move carefully, adjusting themselves constantly. There is little sense of seasonal wardrobes. Everything is worn year-round, layered differently depending on weather. Summer heat brings its own discomfort. Heavy fabrics trap warmth, but removing layers exposes skin to judgment and sunburn alike. Modesty is still enforced, even when impractical. Social rules do not disappear with poverty. They become harder to follow. you notice how clothing affects perception. Clean, intact garments invite slightly kinder treatment. Torn or dirty ones draw suspicion. Employers judge quickly. Authorities judge more harshly. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian society often equated appearance with morality, regardless of circumstance. Historians still debate how conscious this bias was, but its consequences are immediate. Looking respectable, even briefly, can mean access to work or aid. Mending is constant. Needles are precious. Thread is saved in short lengths. Repairs are visible, layered, imperfect. You sew by lamplight or near the hearth, fingers stiff, eyes straining. The goal is not beauty, but function. Each patch extends usefulness a little longer. Winter, especially, rewards those who can keep fabric intact. Despite everything, there is pride here. Not loud pride, but stubborn care. Clothes are brushed when possible. Buttons are kept if they can be. A coat may be old, but it is still yours. It has carried you through weather, through work, through days that demanded more than it could give. You treat it with respect as evening settles and the room fills again with bodies and sound. Coats are hung, folded, or used as blankets. Clothing shifts roles constantly. What kept you warm outside now cushions you on a bench or floor. Nothing has a single purpose. Everything adapts. You curl inward, wrapped in layers that smell of work and persistence. The fabric presses close, familiar and imperfect. It does not promise comfort. It promises continuity. Tomorrow you will put it on again, and again after that, until it can no longer be mended. This is how the Victorian poor are clothed, not elegantly, not comfortably, but persistently. Their garments tell stories of labor, scarcity, and adaptation, stitched together quietly, without ceremony. And as you settle into the night, feeling the weight of fabric and history alike, you understand that even here, among frayed seams and worn soles, life holds together, patched, imperfect, and still moving forward. Illness moves through the lives of the Victorian poor like an uninvited but familiar guest. It doesn't arrive with drama. It settles in quietly, lingering longer than it should, passing from body to body without asking permission. You notice it first in small signs: a cough that won't leave, a feverish flush, a child unusually still in the corner. These symptoms are not immediately alarming. They are expected. You live in close quarters, and sickness thrives on closeness. Damp walls, poor ventilation, limited nutrition, all of it creates an environment where the body is constantly negotiating its limits. A mainstream historical fact is that diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and influenza were common among the Victorian poor. Historians still argue how well people understood the causes of these illnesses. But here, explanation matters less than endurance. Medical care exists, but it is distant and uncertain. Doctors charge fees, hospitals are overcrowded and intimidating. Many people delay seeking help until illness becomes unbearable. You rely instead on home remedies passed down through experience. Warmth, rest, when possible, herbal teas, steam from boiled water. A quirky but true detail is that many poor Victorians believed sweating out illness was beneficial, leading to heavy blankets and closed windows even when air grew stale. Care is communal out of necessity. Someone stays home to watch the sick if they can afford the lost wages. Children are kept close. Food is shared differently. The rhythm of the household adjusts without discussion. A mainstream historical fact is that women often bore the burden of caregiving in poor Victorian families, regardless of their own health. Historians still debate how this affected long-term outcomes, but you see its immediate toll. Illness threatens income as much as health. Missing work means losing wages. Losing wages means hunger. You weigh every decision carefully. Is the fever serious enough to stay home? Can you push through another shift? Many do, until their bodies refuse. This calculation is constant, quiet, and deeply unfair. Death is not abstract here. It is present, visible, and unromantic. Funerals are modest. Mourning is brief. Life does not pause long enough for extended grief. A mainstream historical fact is that life expectancy among the Victorian poor was significantly lower than among the wealthy, particularly for children. Historians still argue about precise numbers, but loss is a familiar companion. And yet, compassion persists. Neighbors bring broth. Someone watches children. A coin is slipped into a hand when possible. These acts are small but vital. They do not erase loss, but they soften it. Survival here is collective. stitched together through shared vulnerability. As night falls, you listen to coughing in the dark, to labored breathing, to whispered reassurance. You lie still, hoping tomorrow brings improvement. Illness teaches patience, humility, and a sharp awareness of how fragile everything is. This is how the Victorian poor face sickness, not with panic, but with weary familiarity. The body endures until it cannot, and then others step in. And as sleep finally arrives, uneven and light, you rest within a fragile network of care that exists not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. As you move deeper into Victorian life, you begin to notice how sharply divided childhood is, depending entirely on which side of wealth you're born into. For the richest, childhood is something to be preserved, protected, and carefully shaped. For the poorest, it is brief, practical, and often over before it's fully understood. You stand in the space between these two realities, watching how the same era treats its youngest members in radically different ways. Among the wealthy, children are surrounded by structure. Nurseries exist, actual rooms set aside just for them, often filled with toys, books, and furniture sized appropriately. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of childhood as a protected stage of life gained strong cultural importance during the Victorian era, especially among the middle and upper classes. Historians still argue whether this was driven by genuine affection or social ideology, but the results are visible. Childhood here is slow and supervised. You watch a well-dressed child practice piano scales under the careful eye of a governess. Mistakes are corrected gently but firmly. Education begins early and follows a strict path. Reading, writing, arithmetic, manners. Play exists, but it is purposeful. Toys are designed to teach discipline, patience, and moral lessons. Even leisure is productive. Childhood is not freedom, it is preparation. Illness among wealthy children is treated with urgency. Doctors are summoned. Diets are adjusted. Fresh air is prescribed, sometimes excessively so. A quirky but real Victorian belief holds that children should be exposed to cold air to strengthen their constitution, leading to open windows even in winter. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these practices, but the intent is clear. Wealthy children are investments worth protecting. Now you turn your attention back toward the poorer districts, where childhood unfolds very differently. Here, children are not sheltered from adult life. They are absorbed into it. There are no nurseries, space does not allow separation. Children sleep where there is room, eat what is available, and learn by watching and doing. Work begins early. Some children help at home fetching water, minding younger siblings, running errands. Others work outside factories, workshops, street selling, domestic service. A mainstream historical fact is that child labor was widespread in Victorian Britain, especially before labor reforms in the late 19th century. Historians still argue how much these reforms actually improved conditions, but for many children, work remains unavoidable. You see small hands blackened with soot, fingers nimble from repetitive tasks. Children move with surprising efficiency, their bodies adapting quickly to labor. They do not complain much, not because they do not feel fatigue, but because it is normal. Hunger, cold, and tiredness are familiar companions. Childhood here is not defined by play, but by contribution. Education exists in theory, but not always in practice. Schools charge fees or require attendance that families cannot afford. Some children attend irregularly, others never attend at all. Literacy rates among the poor improve slowly over the Victorian period, but progress is uneven. You notice how knowledge becomes another dividing line. One more advantage: wealth quietly accumulates. Play does happen, but it is spontaneous and brief. A game in the street, a shared joke, a found object turned into a toy. Laughter appears suddenly and disappears just as fast. These moments are not planned. They exist in the gaps between responsibility. Historians still debate how resilient poor children were, but resilience here feels less like strength and more like adaptation. Health outcomes differ sharply. Poor children are more vulnerable to disease, malnutrition, and injury. Many do not survive into adulthood. This fact hangs quietly over everything. Families love their children deeply, but love does not protect against damp rooms or unsafe machinery. Grief is common, but it is carried privately, folded into daily life rather than displayed. You notice how expectations differ. Wealthy children are told what they might become. Poor children are told what they must do. Futures are imagined in one world and improvised in the other. This difference shapes confidence, posture, even the way children speak. A mainstream historical observation is that class distinctions in Victorian England were reinforced from a very young age. Historians still argue how permeable these boundaries truly were, but from here, they feel solid. As evening settles, wealthy children are guided gently toward bedtimes. Stories read aloud, lamps dimmed. Poor children fall asleep wherever exhaustion finds them, on benches, floors, shared beds. Sleep comes quickly, heavily, without ceremony. Dreams, if they appear, are shaped by the day's labor. You step back and look at both worlds together. Same city, same era, same narrow streets. And yet, childhood itself means something entirely different depending on where you stand. For some, it is stretched carefully, padded with instruction and care. For others, it is compressed, practical, and fleeting. As you let this realization settle, your breathing slows. The contrast is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, and deeply shaping. Victorian society does not merely treat children differently, it teaches them, from the beginning, exactly where they belong. And as night closes in, those lessons, once learned, are rarely forgotten. As night settles fully over the city, you begin to notice how leisure, something that sounds universal, is experienced in sharply different ways depending on wealth. Leisure, in the Victorian era, is not simply free time. It is structured, permitted, and judged. Who is allowed to rest, how they rest, and what that rest looks like reveals more about class than almost anything else. For the wealthy, leisure is cultivated carefully. Evenings are designed to feel calm, elevated, and purposeful. You picture a drawing room softly lit by gas lamps, furniture arranged to encourage polite conversation. Music drifts through the space, piano melodies practiced earlier that day, now performed for guests or family. A mainstream historical fact is that music and cultural refinement were considered essential markers of upper-class respectability. Historians still argue whether these activities were genuinely enjoyed or simply endured. But participation is not optional. Reading fills many hours. Books are chosen thoughtfully, often with moral instruction in mind. Novels are popular, but not all novels are acceptable. Some are criticized for encouraging excessive emotion or imagination. You read carefully, absorbing stories while maintaining control. Leisure must never appear idle. Even relaxation is expected to improve you. Social visits punctuate the week. Calling hours are observed. Invitations are extended and returned. Conversation remains measured, avoiding extremes of opinion or emotion. A quirky but accurate detail is that even laughter is moderated. Loud laughter suggests a lack of refinement. You smile politely instead, expressing amusement without excess. For the poor, leisure exists, but it is unplanned and fragile. It appears in brief moments when work pauses or ends early. After long days of labor, energy for structured entertainment is scarce. Rest happens because the body demands it, not because time allows it. A mainstream historical fact is that the working poor often had little true leisure time, especially before labor reforms reduced working hours. Historians still debate how people mentally coped, but here, rest feels earned rather than expected. You see people gather informally outside doorways, in small rooms, along crowded streets. Conversation is louder, more immediate. Stories are shared quickly. Complaints surface and fade. Humor appears sharp and brief. Often laughter here is not controlled. It bursts out when it can, then disappears just as quickly. Public houses play a significant role. Taverns and pubs offer warmth, light, and social connection. Alcohol provides temporary relief from fatigue and worry. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian reformers often criticized drinking among the poor, blaming it for moral decline. Historians still argue how fair this judgment was, but standing here, the appeal is obvious. A warm room and company are powerful comforts when little else is available. Games appear where space allows: cards, dice, simple competitions. Children play in the streets when they can, inventing entertainment from scraps and imagination. Music exists too, but it is informal singing, humming, shared tunes rather than formal performance. Leisure here is communal, improvised, and vulnerable to interruption. Sunday offers a brief shift. Work pauses for many, though not all. Church attendance varies. Some go for faith, others for warmth, community, or habit. A mainstream historical fact is that religious institutions often provided one of the few structured social outlets for the poor. Historians still debate the sincerity of attendance, but the gathering itself matters. You notice how exhaustion shapes leisure. The poor do not seek constant stimulation, they seek relief. Sitting quietly can be enough. Leaning against a wall, sharing silence, watching the street pass by, these moments become precious. Leisure is not about distraction, it is about recovery. As the night deepens, both worlds retreat indoors. In wealthy homes, lamps are dimmed gradually. Conversations wind down politely. Guests depart at appropriate hours. In poorer districts, noise fades unevenly as bodies give in to fatigue. Some streets remain lively longer, others fall silent quickly. You listen to the city settling in layers, controlled quiet above, tired stillness below. Both are forms of rest shaped by circumstance, and as you breathe slowly, letting these rhythms overlap in your mind, you begin to see how even relaxation reflects the Victorian divide. Rest is never just rest, it is permission, access, and expectation woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life. As you remain awake a little longer, drifting between thoughts, you begin to sense how deeply morality and judgment are woven into everyday Victorian life. This is not morality as loud preaching, but as constant quiet evaluation. Every action, every habit, every appearance is measured by neighbors, by employers, by institutions, and often by the individual themselves. You feel it pressing gently but persistently, shaping behavior without ever needing to announce itself. For the wealthy, morality is displayed through restraint. Excess is frowned upon. Self-control is praised. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian moral culture emphasized discipline, sobriety, and respectability as markers of social worth. Historians still argue whether these values were sincerely held or socially enforced, but here they function as both belief and performance. You act carefully because being seen acting carefully matters. Charity plays a central role. Wealthy Victorians donate money, goods, and time, often through organized institutions. These acts are framed as moral duty rather than generosity. Helping the poor reinforces social hierarchy while appearing benevolent. A quirky but accurate detail is that charitable visits were sometimes conditional. Aid was given only to those deemed deserving. You quickly realize that morality here is not about compassion alone, but about control. Among the poor, morality looks different. Survival takes precedence over appearance. Choices are judged harshly by outsiders who rarely understand the constraints involved. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian society often blamed poverty on moral failings, such as laziness or Historians still debate how widely these views were accepted, but their impact is undeniable. Judgment falls hardest on those with the fewest options. You notice how behavior is policed informally. Neighbors watch one another. Reputations form quickly. A woman seen as careless may lose work opportunities. A man known to drink too much may be avoided by employers. These judgments are not always fair, but they are powerful. Respectability, even among the poor, can mean the difference between assistance and abandonment. Institutions amplify this scrutiny. Workhouses, schools, churches, and charities all enforce standards of behavior. Assistance often comes with rules, attendance requirements, moral instruction, inspections. A mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian poor law system was designed to discourage reliance on aid by making it unpleasant. Historians still argue whether this reduced poverty or deepened suffering. But from where you stand, dignity is often the price of survival. Religion weaves quietly through both worlds. Among the wealthy, faith reinforces order and duty. Among the poor, it offers hope, community, or simply routine. Church bells mark time across class lines. You hear them in every district, calling people toward the same buildings through very different streets. Historians still debate how deeply religious Victorian society truly was, but belief here functions as structure as much as faith. You notice how morality becomes internalized. People judge themselves even when no one is watching. The wealthy worry about propriety. The poor worry about appearing deserving. This self-surveillance is exhausting. It shapes posture, speech, and choice. Even rest is evaluated. Are you resting because you deserve it, or because you have failed? As night deepens further, you feel the weight of this quiet judgment pressing less sharply, softened by fatigue. Bodies grow tired enough to ignore it for a few hours. Lamps dim, streets empty. For a brief window, everyone is simply human breathing, resting, letting go. And as you drift closer to sleep, you understand how Victorian life is not only divided by money, but by constant moral assessment. The richest and poorest live under different conditions, but both carry invisible rules that shape every waking moment. These rules whisper rather than shout, and that is what makes them so powerful. You breathe slowly now, letting the judgments fade into the background hum of the city. Tomorrow, they will return, but for this moment, in the quiet between lamplight and dawn, they loosen their grip just enough to let rest arrive. As the night stretches on and the city's edges soften, your thoughts drift toward the idea of movement, of whether anyone, in the Victorian world, can truly change their position. Social mobility is discussed often in this era, usually with optimism in theory and hesitation in practice. From where you stand, it feels less like a ladder and more like a narrow staircase, crowded and difficult to climb. For the wealthy, movement is subtle and internal. Families rise or fall, not dramatically, but through marriages, investments, and reputation. A bad business decision, an unfortunate scandal, an ill-chosen alliance, these can shift a family standing quietly over years. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian society prized stability over risk, even among entrepreneurs. Historians still argue whether this caution slowed innovation or preserved order, but the effect is clear. Movement at the top is slow and carefully managed. Education plays a key role here. Wealthy children are groomed for continuity. Schools and tutors reinforce not just knowledge, but confidence, speech patterns, and networks. Opportunity circulates within familiar circles. Advancement is rarely sudden. It is anticipated, prepared for, and supported by connections that exist long before they are needed. Among the poor, movement is far more uncertain. Stories circulate of individuals who made it, rose through talent, luck, or sheer persistence. These stories are repeated often, held up as proof that effort alone can overcome circumstance. A mainstream historical fact is that Victorian culture celebrated self-made success, particularly in literature and popular discourse. Historians still debate how common such mobility actually was, but here, it feels rare enough to be remarkable. You notice how these stories function. They inspire hope, but also justify inequality. If success is possible for anyone, then failure can be blamed on the individual rather than the system. This belief weighs heavily on those who struggle. It turns hardship inward, transforming structural limits into personal shame. Education among the poor offers limited escape. Some children attend school irregularly, learning to read and write just enough to broaden their world slightly. Others never attend at all. A mainstream historical fact is that compulsory education laws expanded slowly during the Victorian era, improving literacy over time. Historians still argue how transformative these reforms were. But for many families, immediate survival still outweighs long-term opportunity. Work itself rarely offers advancement. Factory labor is repetitive and rigid. Wages remain low. Promotions are scarce. Skill does not always translate into security. A quirky but telling detail is that many workers remained in the same position for decades, measuring progress not by advancement, but by endurance. You begin to understand how time here is not a path upward, but a loop. Charity and reform promise change, but cautiously. Institutions offer training, apprenticeships, or aid, often tied to strict moral expectations. Some benefit, many do not. Historians still debate whether Victorian reform efforts genuinely expanded opportunity or simply managed poverty more efficiently. From where you stand, progress feels incremental at best, and yet, movement does happen, just not always in the direction imagined. Families slide downward due to illness, injury, or loss of work. A single event can undo years of stability. This fragility is felt most keenly among those just above poverty, who have enough to lose, but not enough to cushion the fall. Victorian life is full of these quiet descents. As you lie there, listening to the distant sounds of the city, you reflect on how movement in this era is constrained by invisible walls. Wealth and poverty are not fixed, but they are sticky. Climbing requires more than effort. It requires time, health, education, and opportunity aligning in rare ways. You let this thought settle gently. Victorian society speaks often of progress, of improvement, of upward motion, but lived experience tells a slower story, one of careful maintenance, fragile balance, and limited paths forward. Your breathing deepens as you drift closer to sleep. The idea of movement fades, replaced by stillness. For tonight, at least, there is no ladder to climb, no ground to lose. There is only rest, suspended briefly between where you are and where you might have been. As the night grows quieter and the city finally loosens its grip, your thoughts drift toward the rhythms that tie all Victorians together. Regardless of wealth, the slow passage of seasons, the repetition of days, and the unremarkable routines that make life feel continuous rather than chaotic. Beneath all the differences you've seen, there is a shared dependence on time moving forward, one ordinary day at a time. Winter weighs heavily on everyone. For the wealthy, it means thicker curtains, more fires, and longer evenings indoors. For the poor, it means cold rooms, damp clothes, and the constant calculation of fuel and food. A mainstream historical fact is that winter mortality rates in Victorian cities were significantly higher, especially among the poor. Historians still argue how much cold itself versus illness contributed, but winter is universally feared. You feel it in the way people prepare quietly, months in advance. Without speaking of it directly, daily routines become survival mechanisms. You wake, dress, eat, work, return, rest, and repeat. The specifics differ wildly, but the structure is familiar everywhere. Routine dulls fear. It makes hardship predictable, and predictability, even when unpleasant, is easier to endure than uncertainty. Victorians cling to routine because it gives shape to lives that might otherwise feel overwhelming. You notice how people mark time in small ways: meals, church bells, factory whistles, lamplighting, bedtime rituals. These signals anchor the day. A quirky but telling detail is that many Victorians could tell the time without clocks, relying instead on sound and habit. Time is not always seen, it is felt. Festivals and holidays punctuate the year gently. Christmas, in particular, grows in cultural importance during the Victorian era. For the wealthy, it becomes sentimental and generous. For the poor, it is modest but meaningful, a rare moment when charity increases and routines soften. Historians still debate how widespread these celebrations truly were, but even small deviations from daily hardship matter deeply. Weather shapes mood and movement. Rain turns streets into mud. Fog blankets the city, slowing everything down. Sunlight, when it appears, lifts spirits disproportionately. You feel how environment presses constantly against the body, influencing energy, patience, and hope. Victorian life is lived in close conversation with the elements, that as the hours pass, fatigue deepens. Bodies settle into rest wherever they can. In grand houses, servants finish their final tasks and retreat below stairs. In cramped rooms, families arrange themselves carefully for sleep. Everyone seeks warmth, quiet, and a few uninterrupted hours. Sleep is not luxurious, but it is necessary. You reflect on how endurance defines this era more than ambition. The Victorian world does not move quickly. Change happens slowly, unevenly, often resisted. People survive not by constant striving, but by holding steady, maintaining routines, preserving what little stability they have, and trusting tomorrow to arrive much like today. Your breathing slows as these thoughts settle. The city's sounds fade into a distant hum. Lamps dim, fires burn lower. For a brief stretch of time, distinctions soften. Rich and poor alike surrender to sleep, their differences paused but not erased. And as you drift deeper into rest, you sense how Victorian life, in all its imbalance and constraint, is held together by ordinary persistence, not by dramatic moments, but by repetition, by waking up again, by doing the same things once more, by enduring quietly, day after day, until time itself carries you forward.
By the time the night has fully deepened, the Victorian city feels softer, almost gentler, as if exhaustion has finally quieted its sharper edges. You lie still, breathing slowly, and let everything you've seen settle together, not as separate stories of rich and poor, but as one long, uneven human rhythm. The contrasts remain, but they no longer clash. They simply coexist, layered like the city itself. You think again of the wealthiest Victorians, tucked away behind thick curtains and heavy doors. Their lives are insulated, regulated, and carefully shaped by rules that promise stability in exchange for constant self-control. Comfort exists there, but it is never simple. It must be maintained, performed, and defended against scandal, change, and decline. Even rest for the wealthy comes wrapped in expectation. Then your thoughts drift back to the poorest Victorians, whose lives are compressed into small spaces and shorter choices. Their days are governed by physical need, work, food, warmth, survival, without the luxury of abstraction. And yet, within that harshness, you've seen adaptability, humor, and community persist, not loudly, not romantically, but steadily, in ways that allow life to continue even when conditions seem determined to wear it down. A mainstream historical truth becomes clear as everything settles. The Victorian era is not defined solely by invention, empire, or industry, but by endurance. Historians still argue about progress during this time, who benefited, who paid the price, and whether the changes justified the costs. But lived experience tells a quieter story. Most people were not chasing greatness. They were managing days. You notice how both wealth and poverty come with their own forms of confinement. The rich are constrained by reputation, ritual, and constant observation. The poor are constrained by material limits and physical exhaustion. Neither group is entirely free. The city itself acts like a structure that holds everyone in place, allowing movement only in narrow, carefully controlled ways. And yet, life flows through those structures anyway. Children grow, illness passes or doesn't, seasons turn, streets change slowly. People adapt without announcing it. Victorian life continues, not because it is fair, but because humans are remarkably good at adjusting to what they are given. As your breathing grows deeper, the details begin to soften. The sound of factory whistles fades into memory. The clatter of carriages becomes distant. The flicker of gas lamps blurs into a warm, steady glow behind your closed eyes. Individual lives dissolve into a general sense of presence. Millions of people, each doing their best within the narrow lanes available to them. Now, gently, the pace slows even further. You are no longer walking those streets. You are no longer measuring rooms or weighing meals or counting hours. The Victorian city recedes into a background hum, like a distant train passing through the night. Its inequalities remain real, but for this moment, they no longer demand your attention. Your body settles, shoulders loosen, jaw unclenches. Breath becomes slow, even, unforced. You don't need to judge this era. You don't need to resolve it. You don't need to carry it any further tonight. Let the rich retreat into their quiet rooms. Let the poor find rest wherever it can be found. Let the city breathe on its own. You followed these lives long enough for one night. Now there's nothing left to do but rest, softly, steadily, allowing the noise of history to fade into something distant and calm, until even that dissolves. Sleep comes not as an ending, but as a pause, a gentle pause, a deserved one.